My name is Margaret Wilson, and at 68 years old, I never imagined I would be sitting at my husband Richard's funeral, clutching my wedding ring, while my 3 children announced to our guests that they had inherited everything. Our mother will be well taken care of, from a distance, Robert declared, his voice echoing through the silent church. 42 years of marriage reduced to an afterthought. Nobody would look me in the eyes. A week later, everything changed in ways I never could have predicted. If you're watching this, please subscribe to hear more stories, and let me know where you're watching from. Your support means the world to me. Richard and I met in the spring of 1979 at a community fundraiser in our small Connecticut town. I was working at the local library, and he had just started his construction business with nothing but a pickup truck and determination. There was something about his smile that day, warm, genuine, with a touch of mischief in his eyes. He asked me to dinner that very night, and I said yes without hesitation. 6 months later, we were married in the same community center where we first met. We started with practically nothing. Our first home was a tiny 1-bedroom apartment above a hardware store. Richard would work 14-hour days, coming home covered in dust and paint, but always with that same warm smile. I kept my job at the library during the day and helped with the books and scheduling for his business at night. We were a team from the very beginning. Maggie, he would say, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. Someday we'll build something great together. And we did. Within 5 years, Wilson Construction had grown from just Richard to a company with 15 employees. By our 10th anniversary, we had built our dream home on 3 acres of land, and were expecting our 3rd child. Robert came first in 1982. He was always serious, even as a child, counting his toys and organizing them by size and color. Elizabeth followed in 1985, bright and ambitious from the moment she could talk. Jason, our youngest, arrived in 1987, creative and sensitive, always trying to keep the peace between his more dominant siblings. As the children grew, so did the business. By the time Richard turned 50, Wilson Construction had become Wilson Development Group, with projects across 3 states and over 100 employees. We had acquired significant wealth, but Richard never forgot where we started. The business is for the family, he would remind the children when they visited the office. Someday all of this will be yours to continue our legacy. The children took different paths as they grew older. Robert went to business school and joined the company right after graduation, expecting to take over someday. Elizabeth became a corporate lawyer, always offering unsolicited legal advice about the business. Jason studied architecture but struggled to find his place, working for the company on and off between creative pursuits. Throughout the years, I remained Richard's partner in everything. Though I was never officially an executive in the company, I was involved in every major decision. The employees called me Mrs. Wilson, with the same respect they showed Richard. Our home became the place where deals were discussed over dinner and contracts were signed in our living room. The business was truly a family affair. Then came that terrible morning last month. Richard and I were having coffee on our back porch, discussing plans for our upcoming anniversary trip, when he suddenly clutched his chest. His coffee mug shattered on the stone floor. "Maggie," he whispered, and then he was gone. Just like that. The doctors later confirmed it was a massive heart attack. At 70, Richard had seemed so vibrant, so full of life. None of us saw it coming. The initial shock was overwhelming. For 2 days I moved through our home in a daze, touching his things, expecting to hear his voice around every corner. I called the children immediately after the paramedics confirmed what I already knew in my heart. They arrived within hours, Robert taking charge of the funeral arrangements, Elizabeth handling calls to family and friends, Jason sitting quietly beside me, occasionally holding my hand. It was during those first days that I noticed something changing. The children were huddled in Richard's office for hours, speaking in hushed tones. When I entered, they would quickly change the subject or disperse entirely. I assumed they were processing their grief in their own way and gave them space. "Mom, do you know where Dad kept his will?" Robert asked on the second evening. The question seemed odd. Richard and I had discussed our wills years ago, and both documents were with our family attorney, Thomas Reynolds. "With Thomas, of course," I replied. "Why do you ask?" "Just taking care of details," Robert said dismissively. "Dad would want everything in order." The next morning, Elizabeth announced they had contacted Thomas and arranged to review the will immediately. I offered to join them, but Elizabeth quickly responded, "No need, Mom. You have enough to deal with. We'll handle the legal matters." It wasn't until they returned from the attorney's office that I began to truly worry. Their expressions were unreadable as they sat me down in the living room. Robert spoke first. "Mom, the will is from 15 years ago. Dad never updated it after the business expansion." Elizabeth continued, her lawyer voice in full effect. "The way it's written, the business and most assets transfer directly to the three of us as blood heirs. There are some complications regarding your position." "Complications?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "What do you mean? Richard and I built everything together." Jason looked uncomfortable but remained silent as his siblings explained that technically, according to the outdated will, I had no legal claim to the business or most of our assets. The house was in a trust for the children. My name was on some accounts but not the most significant ones. "Don't worry, Mom," Robert said in a tone that did nothing to reassure me. "We'll take care of you." The funeral was scheduled for 3 days later. I was still in shock, both from losing Richard and from the realization that my children were already dividing his assets while I sat grieving in the home we had built together. Still, I clung to hope that they were simply handling matters efficiently, that once the funeral was over, we would all come together as the family Richard had been so proud of. I couldn't have been more wrong. The morning of Richard's funeral arrived with appropriately somber weather, gray skies, and a light mist that seemed to veil our small town in grief. I stood in our bedroom, struggling with the clasp of the pearl necklace Richard had given me on our 40th anniversary. My fingers trembled too much to secure it. Eventually, I gave up and placed the pearls back in their velvet box. Richard would understand. St. Michael's Church was filled beyond capacity. Richard had been well respected in the community, both as a businessman and philanthropist. The front pews were reserved for family, myself and our 3 children, Richard's sister Catherine, who had flown in from Arizona, and my brother James with his wife. Behind us sat employees of Wilson Development Group, some who had been with the company for decades and knew Richard better than most. As I entered the church on my brother's arm, I noticed Robert, Elizabeth, and Jason already seated in the front pew. They hadn't come to the house to accompany me to the funeral. Elizabeth glanced up, nodded slightly, then returned to a whispered conversation with her brothers. I took my seat beside them, reaching for Robert's hand. He squeezed mine briefly before withdrawing. "We've prepared some remarks," Elizabeth informed me coolly. "The 3 of us will speak together." I nodded, assuming they had written a loving tribute to their father. Richard would have been touched that his children wanted to honor him with their words. I sat back, clutching my wedding ring, the same simple gold band Richard had placed on my finger 42 years ago. We could have upgraded it many times over the years as our wealth grew, but neither of us wanted to. That original ring held our beginning. The service proceeded with hymns Richard had loved and remarks from our pastor about Richard's contributions to the church building fund and community outreach programs. Then came the moment for the family tribute. My children walked to the pulpit together, a united front in their expensive black mourning clothes. Robert spoke first. "Our father was a builder. He created a legacy that will continue through his children." Elizabeth continued, "We are grateful for his business acumen and the empire he established, which now passes to us." Jason, looking slightly uncomfortable, added, "He taught us the value of security and planning for the future." Then Robert delivered the blow that would echo in my mind for days to come. "As we take ownership of Wilson Development Group and all associated assets, we want to assure everyone that our mother will be well taken care of, from a distance. We believe this arrangement would satisfy our father's wishes for efficiency in business operations." A murmur rippled through the congregation. I felt my brother James stiffen beside me. Across the aisle I saw Thomas Reynolds, our attorney, frowning deeply. But most painful was the sudden inability of anyone to look directly at me. Hundreds of people, many I had known for decades, suddenly found the hymnal, or their shoes, fascinating. The pity was palpable. I sat perfectly still, back straight, face composed. Decades of being the wife of a prominent businessman had taught me how to maintain dignity in public regardless of circumstances. Inside, though, I felt as if I were shattering into 1,000 pieces. The rest of the service passed in a blur. At the cemetery, I stood beneath the green tent as they lowered Richard's casket into the ground. The children arranged themselves on the opposite side, creating a visible division that everyone present could not help but notice. As guests offered condolences at the graveside, my longtime friend Judith Palmer gripped my hands tightly. "This isn't right, Margaret," she whispered fiercely. "Richard would never have wanted this." I could only nod, words failing me completely. The reception following the burial was held at our home, or what had apparently become my children's home, as they made clear by how they hosted the event. Elizabeth directed caterers through rooms she hadn't visited in months before Richard's death. Robert stationed himself by Richard's liquor cabinet, pouring expensive scotch for select business associates. Jason at least had the decency to check on me occasionally, bringing me tea I couldn't drink and food I couldn't eat. As the last guests were leaving, Robert cornered me in the kitchen. "We should talk about arrangements going forward," he said without preamble. "Not today, Robert," I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "Today we bury your father." "Of course," he conceded with a businesslike nod. "Tomorrow then. The three of us will come by at 10. He walked away before I could respond, already engaged in conversation with the CFO of Wilson Development Group about an upcoming project. Judith offered to stay with me that night, but I declined. I needed to be alone with the magnitude of what had happened. Not just losing Richard but potentially losing everything else as well. After everyone left, I walked through our empty house. 40 years of memories filled every room. Our children's height marks on the kitchen door frame. The den where Richard and I would sit by the fire, planning our future. The garden we had planted together, now visible through the window in the fading light. I climbed the stairs to our bedroom and sat on Richard's side of the bed. His pillow still held the indentation of his head. I pressed my face into it, breathing in his fading scent, and finally allowed myself to weep for my husband, for the betrayal of my children, and for the uncertain future that awaited me. That night, I slept in my clothes on top of the covers, clutching Richard's bathrobe. Outside my window, the moon rose over the property that had been my home for decades, the home I now understood my children intended to take from me. The week following Richard's funeral unfolded like a business negotiation, rather than a period of family mourning. True to his word, Robert arrived at precisely 10 the next morning, with Elizabeth and Jason trailing behind him. They carried leather portfolios and spoke in hushed, serious tones as they arranged themselves around our dining room table. The same table where we had celebrated countless Christmas dinners and birthday parties over the years. "Mom, we need to discuss the transition," Robert began without preamble. His voice had taken on the same authoritative tone Richard used for business meetings, but without any of the warmth my husband had always maintained. I had barely slept, but I had made a decision during those long dark hours. I would listen. I would understand exactly what my children intended before I determined how to respond. "What transition are you referring to, Robert?" I asked calmly, pouring myself coffee from the pot I had prepared. Elizabeth took over, sliding documents across the polished mahogany surface. These outline the current situation based on Dad's will. As we mentioned, the business transfers completely to us, as do most of the investment accounts and properties. I glanced at the papers but didn't touch them. "And our home." The three exchanged glances before Jason spoke, his voice quieter than his siblings. "The house is held in the family trust, Mom. Technically, it's now ours too." "I see." I took a careful sip of my coffee. "And where do you expect me to live?" Robert cleared his throat. "We've been looking at some very nice apartments in Riverside Gardens. It's a senior community about 20 minutes from here." "Senior community," I repeated. At 68, I was hardly infirm. Richard and I had been planning a hiking trip to New Zealand before his heart attack. "It's quite luxurious," Elizabeth added quickly. "They have activities, security, and medical staff on call. We think you'll be quite comfortable there." "And who will pay for this apartment, since you're taking control of all our assets?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Elizabeth pulled out another document. "We've worked out a monthly allowance that should cover your needs. The apartment, utilities, a reasonable food budget, and some discretionary spending." "An allowance?" The word tasted bitter on my tongue. After 42 years of marriage, after helping build a multimillion-dollar company from nothing, my children were putting me on an allowance like a teenager. It's quite generous, Mom, Robert insisted, pointing to a figure on the page that was less than what Richard and I typically spent on charity donations each month. And the business? I asked. I've been involved in every aspect of Wilson development since before any of you were born. That's part of what we need to discuss, Robert continued. We feel it's best if you step back completely. Your involvement might confuse employees about the new leadership structure. My hands began to tremble slightly, and I placed my coffee cup down to hide it. When do you expect this transition to happen? We've already begun the legal process, Elizabeth said. As for the house, we're thinking of putting it on the market next month. Spring is the best time to sell, and this property should attract significant interest. Next month. I couldn't hide my shock. You want me out of my home within a month of your father's death? Jason at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. We thought it might be easier for you, Mom. Too many memories here. How considerate, I said, unable to keep the edge from my voice. The meeting continued for another hour, with my children outlining how they planned to dismantle the life Richard and I had built together. Robert would take over as CEO of Wilson Development. Elizabeth would handle legal affairs while maintaining her separate law practice. Jason would be given a position overseeing design, though it was clear his siblings didn't value his input much. As they prepared to leave, Robert placed a business card on the table. This is the contact information for Linda Peterson, the real estate agent we've selected. She'll be in touch to schedule a time to photograph the house. After they left, I sat motionless at the dining table, staring at the business card. The magnitude of what was happening finally hit me fully. My children were not just taking the business, they were erasing me from the life Richard and I had created. That afternoon my phone rang. It was Thomas Reynolds, our family attorney. Margaret, I've been trying to reach you, he said, his normally measured tone tinged with concern. Can we meet privately? There are some matters regarding Richard's estate that I believe we should discuss without your children present. We arranged to meet at his office the following day. That night I barely slept, pacing the rooms of my home, touching familiar objects and wondering which ones I would be allowed to keep. The large portrait of Richard and me on our 30th anniversary that hung above the fireplace. The collection of first edition books we had gathered over decades. The antique writing desk where I had helped Richard draft his first major construction bid. By morning, grief had begun to transform into something else. A slow-burning anger that gave me strength I didn't know I still possessed. Thomas's office was located in a converted Victorian house in the center of town. He had been our attorney for over 30 years, handling everything from business contracts to personal matters. He greeted me with a warm hug, the first genuine human contact I'd experienced since the funeral. Margaret, I am so sorry, he said, leading me to a comfortable chair in his office. Not just for Richard's passing, but for what's happening now. You know then, I said. He nodded grimly. Robert called me immediately after the funeral to begin transfer procedures. I've been trying to slow things down, but they've already consulted another attorney who's pushing aggressively on their behalf. Can they do this, Thomas? Can they really take everything? Thomas sighed heavily. Richard's will is problematic. It was created when the company was much smaller and the children were still young. He always meant to update it. He paused. In fact, Richard called me just 2 weeks before he passed away. He wanted to make significant changes. My heart stuttered. What kind of changes? He never specified exactly, but he mentioned wanting to ensure you were protected from certain influences. He seemed concerned about something, Margaret. But he never completed the new will. No. We had an appointment scheduled for next month. Thomas looked genuinely distressed. Without those changes, the current will does give the children significant legal leverage. Not as much as they seem to think, but enough to cause problems. What about marital property laws? We built everything together. That's where you have some standing. Connecticut law does provide certain protections. At minimum, you should be entitled to a third of the estate regardless of the will. But fighting your children will be costly and unpleasant. I left Thomas's office with more questions than answers, and a growing sense that Richard had seen something coming that I had missed entirely. That night, I searched through his personal papers, looking for any clue about what had concerned him enough to consider changing his will after 15 years. In his desk drawer, I found bank statements showing large withdrawals from our joint accounts over the past year, money transferred to the children. Robert had received funds for what was listed as investment opportunity. Elizabeth's transfers were labeled property acquisition. Even Jason had received substantial amounts for business development. Had Richard been giving them early inheritances, or had they been pressuring him for money? The statements revealed a pattern that made me increasingly uneasy. Unable to sleep, I called my friend Judith shortly before midnight. "They're taking everything, Judy," I said when she answered. "The house, the business, the investments. They want to move me into a senior apartment and put me on an allowance." "Oh, Margaret." Her voice filled with indignation. "Richard would be horrified." "I keep thinking I must have done something wrong," I admitted. "Were we bad parents? Did we raise them to be this way?" "Stop that right now," Judith said firmly. "You and Richard were wonderful parents. Some people just change when money is involved. Even family." "I don't know what to do," I confessed. "I can't bear the thought of fighting my own children, but I can't just let them erase 40 years of my life either." "You fight," Judith said without hesitation. "Not just for yourself but for what Richard would have wanted. He built that company for his family. And you are his family. You were there from the beginning." After we hung up, I stood at our bedroom window, looking out at the property Richard and I had lovingly developed over decades. The moonlight silvered the gardens I had planted, the pool we had added for the grandchildren who rarely visited, the workshop where Richard still spent weekends tinkering with projects. "What should I do, Richard?" I whispered to the empty room. The answer came not in a supernatural voice but in a memory. Richard standing firmly against a contractor who tried to cheat us in the early days. "Never let anyone take what you've earned, Maggie," he had said. "Not even family. Especially not family." As dawn broke, I made my decision. I would not go quietly. 3 days later, Robert called to inform me that they had scheduled a family meeting at the house that afternoon. His tone suggested this was a courtesy notification rather than a request for my availability. "We'll be bringing Linda Peterson to discuss listing the property," he added. "Try to have the house presentable, Mom." The condescension in his voice ignited something in me. This was my home, not a property to be staged and sold. I spent the morning not cleaning as instructed, but instead going through Richard's home office more thoroughly, searching for anything that might help me understand what had been happening before his death. At precisely 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find my 3 children standing with a stylishly dressed woman in her 40s, who carried a leather portfolio similar to Elizabeth's. "Mom, this is Linda Peterson from Luxury Real Estate Partners," Robert said, ushering the woman past me without waiting for my response. "Mrs. Wilson, your home is absolutely stunning," Linda gushed, already eyeing the foyer with a professional assessment. "The original moldings alone will be a major selling point." "Thank you, Miss Peterson," I replied coolly, though I wasn't aware my home was for sale. An uncomfortable silence followed as we moved to the living room. I had deliberately not prepared refreshments, nor had I made the house presentable, as Robert had instructed. A half-finished cup of tea sat on the coffee table, and Richard's reading glasses remained where he had left them beside his favorite chair. "Well," Linda began brightly, seemingly oblivious to the tension, "I've prepared some preliminary market analysis. Properties in this area with similar square footage are listing at around 3.2 million, but given the custom features and the acreage, I believe we could start at 3.8. "That won't be necessary," I said calmly. Linda looked confused. "Excuse me. My home is not for sale, Miss Peterson. I'm sorry you've been brought here under false pretenses." Robert's face darkened. "Mom, we've already discussed this. The house is held in the family trust." "Yes, the trust that your father established for our retirement and eventual transfer to you after both of us had passed," I corrected him. "Richard never intended for me to be removed from my home, while I'm still very much alive." Elizabeth leaned forward. Mom, legally speaking, the trust gives us authority to manage the assets as we see fit. We believe selling this oversized property is the most practical solution. Practical for whom? I asked. For me? Or for the three of you who want to cash in immediately? The real estate agent glanced between us uncomfortably. Perhaps I should give the family some privacy to discuss this. That would be best, I agreed. After Linda excused herself with promises to circle back when the timing is better, I faced my children directly. Now let's be completely honest with each other. This isn't about what's practical or what your father would have wanted. This is about money. That's unfair, Mom, Jason protested weakly. We're trying to make sure everything is managed properly. Is that what you call it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the three of you are dismantling everything your father and I built together before he's even been gone 2 weeks. Robert's facade of professionalism cracked slightly. Dad built the business, Mom. You were just supporting him. The statement hit me like a physical blow. Just supporting him? I worked beside your father from day one. I managed the books when we couldn't afford an accountant. I networked with clients when he was too busy on job sites. I raised the three of you so he could focus on growing the company. That's what wives did in your generation, Elizabeth said dismissively. It doesn't entitle you to equal ownership. Is that what they taught you in law school, Elizabeth? That marriage isn't a partnership. I could feel decades of unspoken tensions rising to the surface. Your father always said the business was for the family. When did I stop being family to you three? An uncomfortable silence fell. Then Robert spoke, his voice now tinged with long-harbored resentment. You always had more influence over Dad than any of us. He listened to you, not his own children. He listened to good advice regardless of where it came from, I countered. He would have listened to you too if you'd shown genuine interest in the company beyond what you could get from it. That's not fair, Elizabeth interjected. Robert has worked at Wilson Development for 15 years. Yes, starting at vice president with no prior experience because your father gave him that position, I pointed out. And you, Elizabeth, how many times did you call your father for money when your law practice was struggling? And Jason, I turned to my youngest, who at least had the decency to look ashamed. The art gallery your father funded, the failed restaurant investment, the design school tuition he paid 3 times because you kept changing your mind. We're his children, Robert said defensively. And I'm his wife. My voice rose for the first time. I was with Richard for 42 years. I helped him create everything you're now so eager to divide among yourselves. Elizabeth's cold professional demeanor returned. Mom, getting emotional won't change the legal reality. The will gives us control. We're prepared to be generous with your living allowance, but the business decisions are ours now. I stood up slowly, a lifetime of accommodating others finally giving way to righteous anger. I want all of you to leave my house right now. Mom, Jason began, but I cut him off. No. I've heard enough. You've made your positions crystal clear. Now I need time to consider mine. There's nothing to consider, Robert insisted. The documents are already being processed. Leave, I repeated, moving to the front door and opening it wide. Now. After a moment of stunned silence, they gathered their things and filed past me. Elizabeth paused in the doorway. We're meeting with the business transition team tomorrow. You should start packing your personal items. We can arrange for storage if needed. The door closed behind them with a finality that broke something inside me. For the first time since Richard's death, I allowed myself to collapse completely. I sank to the floor of our foyer, great heaving sobs tearing through my body. The grief of losing Richard combined with the betrayal by our children created a pain so acute I could barely breathe. I'm not sure how long I remained there, curled on the Italian marble we had selected together during a trip to Florence for our 25th anniversary. The sound of knocking eventually penetrated my misery. I considered ignoring it, but the knocking persisted, followed by a concerned voice. Margaret? It's Patricia from next door. Are you all right? Patricia Campbell had been our neighbor for over a decade. A retired nurse in her 70s, she had always been kind but not intrusive. I dragged myself to my feet and opened the door, not bothering to hide my tear-stained face. Oh, Margaret. She took one look at me and stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Without asking permission, she guided me to the kitchen, sat me down, and put the kettle on. I saw your children leave. They didn't look happy. They want to take everything, I said, my voice hoarse from crying. The house, the business, everything Richard and I built together. Patricia placed a cup of tea in front of me and sat across the table. Tell me, she said simply. And I did. The words poured out of me. The funeral announcement, the outdated will, the senior apartment, the allowance, the real estate agent. Patricia listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly troubled. Have you spoken to a lawyer? She asked when I finally fell silent. Our family attorney, yes. He says I have some rights under marital property laws, but fighting my own children. My voice trailed off. Patricia reached across the table and gripped my hand with surprising strength. Margaret Wilson, you listen to me. My husband died when I was 52. His brother tried to take our house, claiming family money had paid for it. I nearly gave in because fighting family seemed wrong. What did you do? I asked. I fought, she said simply. Not just for the house but for my dignity. And Margaret, I've never regretted it for a single day. As evening fell, Patricia helped me to bed with a mild sedative from her own prescription. Rest, she instructed. Tomorrow you start fighting back. That night I dreamed of Richard. Not as he was at the end, but as the young man with paint on his hands and dreams in his eyes who had promised to build something wonderful with me. In the dream, he smiled and said, Remember where I kept the important things, Maggie. I woke with the first light of dawn, the dream still vivid in my mind. The important things, I whispered, suddenly understanding what my subconscious was telling me. Richard had always been systematic, especially about business matters. While he embraced digital record-keeping for the company, he maintained a personal filing system for what he called the important things. This system was contained in a fireproof lockbox kept in his closet, behind his collection of hand-tailored suits. I went directly to the closet, pushing aside the hanging clothes. The familiar scent of Richard's cologne still clung to the fabrics, bringing a fresh wave of grief that I pushed aside. There was no time for tears now. The lockbox was where it had always been, secured with a key that Richard had kept on his personal keyring. After his death, the hospital had returned his personal effects to me, wallet, watch, and keys. I had placed them in my jewelry box, unable to dispose of these last items he had touched. I retrieved the key and returned to the closet. The lockbox opened with a satisfying click, revealing neatly labeled folders containing birth certificates, marriage license, property deeds, and insurance policies. But what caught my eye was a sealed envelope marked simply, "For Maggie, Private." With trembling fingers, I opened it to find a letter written in Richard's distinctive handwriting, dated just 3 weeks before his death. "My dearest Maggie," it began. "If you're reading this, I need to explain some concerns that have been troubling me. I've scheduled an appointment with Thomas to update our will, but in case anything happens before that meeting, you need to know the truth." The letter continued, detailing Richard's growing concerns about our children's financial demands over the past year. Robert had approached him multiple times for business loans that were never documented. Elizabeth had asked for money to buy property investments that Richard couldn't find any record of. Even Jason had requested funds for a new business venture, but provided no business plan. "I fear they see the company as their inheritance rather than our shared achievement," Richard wrote. "I've tried to teach them the value of hard work, but perhaps our success made things too easy for them. Regardless, I want to ensure that you are protected. You are my true partner, the foundation of everything we've built." The letter concluded with specific instructions. "Check the blue folder in my golf locker at the country club. You'll find documents regarding additional accounts I've maintained separately from our main finances. These are for your security, Maggie, no matter what happens." I sat back on my heels, the letter clutched to my chest. Richard had seen the potential for problems. He had been taking steps to protect me. The knowledge both comforted and saddened me. Comforted because I knew he had cared. Saddened because he had recognized our children's true nature before I had. That afternoon, I drove to Lakeview Country Club where Richard and I had been members for 20 years. The staff greeted me with sympathy and immediate access to Richard's locker. Inside, beneath golf shoes and gloves, was a blue folder containing documents for offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, investment properties in Florida and Arizona held under a separate LLC, and stock certificates for companies unrelated to Wilson Development. These assets, conservatively valued, represented millions of dollars our children knew nothing about. The accounts were all in my name or jointly held with rights of survivorship. Richard had created a safety net beyond the reach of the outdated will. My next stop was Wilson Development Group headquarters. I had not been to the office since Richard's death, and my arrival caused a stir among the employees who had attended the funeral and witnessed my children's announcement. Mrs. Wilson, Richard's longtime assistant Deborah exclaimed, rising to embrace me. We've been so worried about you. Thank you, Deborah. Is William in? William Sanders had been Richard's business partner for 30 years. Though he had sold his ownership stake to Richard a decade ago, he had remained as a senior advisor. William's face registered surprise and then genuine pleasure when I was shown into his office. Margaret, he said warmly, coming around his desk to take both my hands in his. I've been hoping you would come in. I need your help, William, I said directly, and I need absolute discretion. William nodded gravely. Of course. I've been concerned about certain developments since Richard's passing. For the next hour, William confirmed what Richard's letter had suggested. My children, particularly Robert, had been positioning themselves for greater control of the company for months. Robert had been meeting with investors without Richard's knowledge. Elizabeth had been reviewing corporate structure documents and asking pointed questions about ownership transfers. Richard was troubled by it, William confided. He mentioned updating his estate plans to ensure the company's stability. He was especially concerned about maintaining the company culture and commitments to long-term employees. Did he discuss specific changes with you? William hesitated. He mentioned creating a trust that would give you controlling interest, with the children receiving profit distributions but limited voting rights until certain conditions were met. This aligned with conversations Richard and I had over the years about the children's readiness for leadership. While we had always planned for them to inherit the business eventually, Richard had consistently stressed the importance of earning responsibility, rather than simply being granted it. As I prepared to leave, William placed a hand on my arm. Margaret, what are you planning to do? I'm not entirely sure yet, I admitted. But I know I can't allow my children to erase me from the life Richard and I built together. Whatever you decide, you have allies here, William said firmly. Many of us remember who was there from the beginning. My next step was to consult with a lawyer. Not Thomas Reynolds, who had been our family attorney for decades, but someone without prior connections to Richard or our children. Patricia recommended her own attorney, Sarah Goldstein, who specialized in estate disputes. Sarah's office was smaller than Thomas's but exuded efficiency. After reviewing the documents I had discovered and listening to the entire situation, she leaned back in her chair with a thoughtful expression. Mrs. Wilson, you actually have a much stronger position than your children have led you to believe, she said. Connecticut law provides significant protections for surviving spouses, regardless of the will's contents. At minimum, you're entitled to a third of the estate under statutory share rights. And the additional assets Richard placed in my name? Those are yours completely outside the probate process. Your husband created an effective safety net. She paused. However, challenging the will directly could lead to a protracted legal battle with your children. Family court disputes can become ugly and drain resources on all sides. What alternatives do I have? Sarah smiled for the first time. Several, actually. Based on what you've shown me, we could pursue a strategy that might avoid court altogether. Your late husband left you with more leverage than your children realize. As I left Sarah's office, my phone rang. It was Patricia. How did it go with Sarah? She asked without preamble. Better than I expected. I have options. Good. Now there's someone else you should meet. My daughter Karen is visiting this weekend. She's a corporate attorney in New York, specializes in business succession disputes. Tough as nails and twice as sharp. Patricia, you've already done so much. Nonsense, she interrupted. Come for dinner tomorrow at 6. Karen will be there. And Margaret? Bring those documents you found today. The next evening I met Karen Campbell, who indeed proved to be both tough and sharp. After reviewing my documents and hearing the situation, she leaned forward with intense focus. "Mrs. Wilson, your children have made a critical mistake. They've shown their hand completely while underestimating you entirely." Her smile was predatory. "I think it's time to change the game." For the next several hours, Karen, Patricia, and I developed a strategy that would utilize both the legal leverage I possessed and the element of surprise. By the time I returned home, I had a clear path forward and something I hadn't felt since Richard's death: hope. As I prepared for bed that night, I looked at our wedding photo on the nightstand. Richard and I, young and full of dreams, standing in front of the community center where we'd met. "I'm fighting for us, Richard," I whispered to his smiling image. "For everything we built together." For the first time since the funeral, I slept soundly through the night. Over the next 2 weeks, I maintained the appearance of a grieving widow slowly accepting her children's decisions. When Robert called to inform me that they had scheduled a meeting with the senior living community, I agreed to attend without protest. When Elizabeth emailed documents for me to sign, I replied that I was reviewing them carefully. When Jason texted to ask about which furniture I wanted to keep, I responded with a short list of sentimental items. Meanwhile, Karen Campbell orchestrated a careful investigation into my children's finances and activities. What we discovered confirmed Richard's suspicions and revealed even more troubling patterns. Robert had accumulated substantial gambling debts at casinos in Atlantic City and online poker sites. The investment opportunity funds Richard had provided had gone directly to pay off creditors. He had also been systematically inflating his expense accounts at Wilson Development for years. Elizabeth, despite her outward appearance of financial success, was leveraged to the breaking point. Her law practice was struggling, and she had purchased an extravagant home in Greenwich that she could barely afford. She had also recently invested in a vacation property in Vail, using money from Richard that was supposedly for property acquisition related to Wilson Development. Jason's situation was less calculated, but equally concerning. His artistic pursuits and business ventures had consistently failed, leaving him financially dependent on his parents. The latest funds from Richard had been spent on an expensive sports car rather than the business development he had claimed. All 3 children had significant debts and lifestyles that required substantial ongoing income. The inheritance they expected would solve their financial problems, if they could access it quickly enough. Karen also uncovered that Robert had already approached several investors about selling portions of Wilson Development once the transfer was complete. Elizabeth had drafted employment termination letters for several long-term executives who would likely remain loyal to me. They were planning a complete company overhaul that would dismantle much of what Richard had built. Armed with this information, I agreed to a meeting at my home to finalize arrangements, as Robert phrased it. The children arrived together, as they had been doing since the funeral, presenting a united front. "Mom, we've prepared the final documents for the property transfer and business transition," Robert announced, spreading papers across the dining table. "Once you sign these, we can proceed with listing the house. And we've secured you a lovely apartment at Riverside Gardens," Elizabeth added. "It has a sunroom and a view of the community garden." I nodded thoughtfully, examining the papers without comment. "These seem very comprehensive," I said finally. "You've thought of everything." "We want to make this transition as smooth as possible," Jason offered, seemingly relieved by my cooperative tone. "I appreciate that," I said, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "Before I sign, though, I have a few documents of my own that you should review." I opened a folder and distributed copies of bank statements, showing the offshore accounts and property deeds Richard had secured in my name. "Your father was always thorough about planning for the future," I explained as they examined the papers with growing confusion. "These assets are outside the will and trust completely." Robert looked up sharply. "What is this? Dad never mentioned these accounts." "There are many things your father didn't share with you," I replied calmly. "Just as there are things you didn't share with him, like your gambling debts, Robert, or your failing law practice, Elizabeth, or your non-existent business venture, Jason." Their expressions shifted from confusion to shock, and then defensiveness. You've been investigating us? Elizabeth demanded, her lawyer persona reasserting itself. Let's call it due diligence, I countered. Something your father taught me was essential in business dealings. The doorbell rang at that moment, perfect timing as Karen had planned. That would be my attorney, I said, rising to answer it. Karen entered with commanding presence, dressed impeccably in a designer suit that eclipsed Elizabeth's attempts at professional attire. Mrs. Wilson, are we ready to proceed? She asked, setting her briefcase on the table. Yes, I believe we are. I gestured to my children. Karen Campbell, meet Robert, Elizabeth, and Jason. My children were just reviewing some financial information. Karen nodded curtly to them before opening her briefcase and extracting additional documents. These are the legal filings we're prepared to submit tomorrow morning if necessary, she explained, sliding them across the table. They include a challenge to the will based on spousal rights, documentation of assets concealed from the estate, evidence of financial impropriety involving company funds, and a request for injunctive relief to prevent any company transfers pending resolution. This is ridiculous, Robert sputtered. Dad's will is clear. The will may be clear, but it's not the only legal document that matters, Karen replied smoothly. Connecticut law provides Mrs. Wilson with statutory rights regardless of the will's contents. Additionally, we have documentation of your father's intent to update his estate plan specifically to protect your mother. Elizabeth, recovering her composure, leaned forward. What exactly are you proposing? I retook my seat at the head of the table, Richard's old place. I'm proposing we avoid an ugly, public legal battle that would damage the company and family reputation irreparably. Instead, we renegotiate the terms of inheritance in a way that honors your father's true wishes. Which you claim to know better than his actual will, Robert said bitterly. I knew your father for 42 years, I replied evenly. We built everything we have together. And yes, I do know what he wanted for his company to thrive and his family to be secure, including me. Karen distributed another document. This is our proposed settlement agreement. Mrs. Wilson retains ownership of this house and 51% of Wilson Development Group. The three of you receive equal shares of the remaining 49%, along with distributions of other assets as outlined on page 3. This is extortion, Robert snapped. This is negotiation, Karen corrected. And significantly more generous than what you'd likely receive if we pursue this in court. You're bluffing, Elizabeth challenged. You wouldn't drag the family through a public legal battle. I looked each of my children in the eye. I would prefer not to, but make no mistake. I will not be erased from the life your father and I built together. I am offering you partnership, not exclusion as you offered me. Jason, who had been quiet throughout, finally spoke. What happens to the company under this arrangement? Who runs it day to day? Robert can maintain his executive role, I conceded. But major decisions require board approval, and I will chair the board. William Sanders has agreed to return as a board member as well. William is involved in this? Robert looked genuinely alarmed for the first time. Many people who cared about your father are concerned about the company's future, I said. This arrangement protects the business while respecting everyone's contributions. A tense silence fell over the table. Finally, Elizabeth spoke. We need time to review these documents with our own counsel. Of course, Karen replied. You have until tomorrow at noon. After that, we file our court documents. After my children departed with our proposal, Karen and I sat in the living room, emotionally exhausted but cautiously optimistic. They'll accept, Karen predicted. They have too much to lose by fighting, especially once their own financial situations are exposed. I never wanted it to come to this, I admitted. I still remember them as children, before money and status became so important. Karen's expression softened slightly. You're not just fighting for yourself, Margaret. You're fighting for your husband's legacy and the company he built. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for family is establish boundaries they can't cross. The next morning, I received a call from Elizabeth. We've reviewed the agreement with our attorney, she said, her voice carefully neutral. We have some proposed amendments regarding board composition and distribution schedules. I'll have Karen review them, I replied. But the core terms are non-negotiable. There was a pause before Elizabeth continued, her voice losing some of its professional detachment. Mom, we didn't handle this well. After Dad died, everything seemed to happen so fast. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was the closest thing to vulnerability I had heard from my daughter in years. Grief affects us all differently, I offered. But actions have consequences, Elizabeth. Your father and I taught you that when you were children. We'll sign the agreement with the amendments we've proposed if they're acceptable to you, she concluded, her business tone returning. 2 days later, we gathered at Thomas Reynolds' office to sign the modified agreement. My children were subdued but professional as we worked through the documents. The amended terms maintained my controlling interest, while providing the children with guaranteed board positions and specified profit distributions. The house remained mine, along with the offshore accounts Richard had established. As we completed the signing, Robert paused before standing. I still don't understand why Dad never told us about those other accounts. I considered my response carefully. Your father believed in testing character before entrusting power. He wanted to see how you would handle what you knew about before revealing more. And we failed the test, Jason said quietly. I looked at my youngest son, seeing a glimmer of the sensitive boy he had once been. There are always more tests, Jason. What matters is learning from failure. As we prepared to leave, Thomas asked to speak with me privately. When the others had exited to the reception area, he closed his office door. Margaret, I want you to know that Richard would be proud of how you've handled this. He always said you were the strongest person he knew. I didn't feel strong, I admitted. I felt betrayed and terrified. Yet you fought back with dignity and fairness, Thomas observed. You protected yourself while still leaving your children a path forward. That takes true strength. I left the office feeling as though a weight had been lifted. Not just the worry about my financial future, but the heavier burden of feeling erased from my own life story. I had reclaimed my place, not just as Richard's widow, but as an essential part of everything we had built together. The months following our agreement brought significant changes to both Wilson Development Group and our family dynamics. The legal restructuring was relatively straightforward. Rebuilding relationships proved far more complex. The board of directors was reorganized with me as chairperson, William Sanders returning as vice chair, Robert maintaining his executive role, and Elizabeth and Jason taking positions that aligned with their skills rather than their expectations. We also added 2 independent directors with industry experience to ensure balanced decision-making. At our first official board meeting, I made my leadership philosophy clear. Wilson Development was built on relationships, integrity, and long-term thinking. Those values will continue to guide us, without exception. Some of the changes Robert had begun implementing were reversed. We recalled the termination letters for the loyal executives. Projects were evaluated based on sustainability rather than quick profits. Gradually, the company culture Richard had cultivated began to reassert itself. The courthouse proceedings to formalize our agreement were brief and private, with Judge Maria Sanchez approving the terms with minimal modifications. Family business disputes are among the most painful cases that come before me, she commented. I commend you for finding a resolution that preserves both the business and the possibility of healing. Healing, however, required more than legal documents. The breach of trust had cut deeply, and rebuilding would take time and consistent effort from all sides. Jason was the first to approach me independently, arriving at the house one evening about a month after our agreement was signed. He sat awkwardly in the living room, looking around as if seeing it through new eyes. I keep thinking about all the Christmas mornings in this room, he said. The train set Dad would set up around the tree every year. He kept doing that long after you children were grown. I told him, said it wasn't Christmas without the trains. Jason's eyes glistened. I'm sorry, Mom. I got caught up in what Robert and Elizabeth were planning. I should have stood up for you. Why didn't you? I asked, not accusingly but with genuine curiosity. He considered the question carefully. I've always been the one who needed help, financially, emotionally. I think I was afraid of losing their support if I opposed them. He paused. And maybe I was afraid of the responsibility that comes with really honoring Dad's legacy. It was an honest answer, more insightful than I had expected. Your father always said you had the greatest capacity for growth among the three of you. He did. Jason seemed surprised. He said your sensitivity could be a strength if you learned to balance it with conviction. Our conversation that evening didn't instantly repair the damage, but it opened a door. Jason began visiting regularly, asking questions about the early days of the company and, more importantly, listening to the answers. He proposed creating a foundation in Richard's name to support trade education for underprivileged youth, something his father had always been passionate about. The Richard Wilson Foundation became a project that gave me new purpose. Using a portion of the assets Richard had secured for me, we established scholarships and apprenticeship programs that would help young people enter the construction and development fields. I served as the foundation's president, with Jason as executive director. Elizabeth's reconciliation took a different path. Always the pragmatist, she approached our new relationship as a strategic alliance at first. She began consulting me on legal matters related to the company, initially keeping discussions strictly professional. Gradually, our conversations expanded to include her challenges with balancing career ambitions and personal fulfillment. During one such conversation, about 6 months after our agreement, Elizabeth finally addressed the inheritance conflict directly. I convinced myself we were doing what was best for the company, she admitted. But I was also terrified about my own financial situation. I'd overextended myself trying to project success. You never needed to pretend with family, I told her. Your father and I would have helped if you'd simply asked honestly. That was always harder for me than for the boys, she said. I wanted to prove I could succeed independently. Independence is admirable, I replied. But so is interdependence, knowing when to lean on others and when to stand firm. Elizabeth began bringing her children to visit more frequently. My grandchildren, who had been distant figures at holidays and occasional family events, became regular presences in my home. 7-year-old Sophia and 5-year-old James filled the house with noise and energy that had been missing since their grandfather's death. Robert proved the most resistant to genuine reconciliation. He maintained a cordial but distant relationship, focusing on business matters and avoiding personal conversations. His gambling had apparently stopped after our confrontation, but the trust between us remained fractured. The turning point came unexpectedly, nearly a year after Richard's death. During a board meeting, a major client expressed concerns about a project Robert was overseeing. Rather than defending him unconditionally or undermining his authority, I suggested a joint meeting where we could address the concerns together. After successfully resolving the situation, Robert and I found ourselves alone in the conference room. You could have used that situation to prove I'm not capable of leading, he said. That was never my goal, Robert. I want you to succeed. Your father wanted that too. But on your terms. On terms that honor the company's values, I corrected. Your father built this business to last generations, not to maximize short-term profits. Robert was silent for a long moment. I always felt I was competing with the company for Dad's attention, he finally said. And losing. The admission revealed a wound I hadn't fully recognized. One that perhaps explained some of Robert's actions after Richard's death. Your father was proud of you, I told him. But he wanted you to earn your place here, not just inherit it. And I took shortcuts, Robert acknowledged. I wanted to prove I could be as successful as he was, but faster. There are no shortcuts to building something that lasts, I said. That was one of your father's fundamental beliefs. Our relationship remained complicated, but that conversation marked a shift toward something more authentic. Robert began consulting me more genuinely on business decisions, occasionally acknowledging that my experience offered valuable perspective. As the 1-year anniversary of Richard's death approached, I decided to host a memorial dinner at our home. The home that remained mine, where all our family memories resided. All 3 children attended with their families, along with William Sanders, Thomas Reynolds, and a few other close friends who had supported me through the difficult year. Before dinner, I gathered everyone in the living room where framed photos of Richard throughout his life were displayed. Richard believed in building things that last. I began. Not just buildings but relationships, community, and family legacy. This past year tested that legacy severely. I looked at each of my children in turn. We've all made mistakes and experienced pain. But we're still here, still a family, still continuing what Richard started. He would be proud of that resilience, even if he would have been disappointed by the conflict that made it necessary. After dinner, as everyone was preparing to leave, Robert approached me privately. "Mom, I found something in Dad's old office at headquarters," he said, handing me a small wrapped package. It was in his desk with a note saying it was for your anniversary. Inside was a simple silver compass with an inscription. "To Maggie, you have always been my true north. Love, Richard." The gift brought tears to my eyes. One final message from my husband that seemed perfectly timed for this moment of family reconciliation. As the second year without Richard unfolded, I found myself embracing new opportunities one hadn't anticipated. The foundation work gave me purpose, but I also discovered a talent for mentoring young entrepreneurs, particularly women entering the male-dominated construction and development industries. The company flourished under the balanced leadership structure we had established. Robert's business acumen, tempered by the values I insisted upon, drove sustainable growth. Elizabeth's legal expertise protected our interests while Jason's design sensibility brought fresh energy to our projects. My role as board chair provided continuity and vision. I still missed Richard every day. There were moments when I would turn to share a thought with him before remembering he wasn't there. But the acute pain of grief had softened into a gentler sadness that coexisted with newfound strength and purpose. On what would have been our 44th anniversary, I visited Richard's grave alone. The granite headstone was elegant but not ostentatious, much like the man himself. "We're okay, Richard," I said quietly. "Not perfect but healing. The company is strong. The children are finding their way. And I paused, realizing the truth of what I was about to say. I've discovered I'm stronger than I knew. Looking back on the journey from that devastating funeral to where I stood now, I recognized how close I had come to being erased from my own life story. By fighting for my place, not just financially but in the family narrative, I had honored not only myself but also the true partnership Richard and I had shared. The most valuable lesson I learned through this ordeal was that preparing legally for the unexpected is an act of love. Richard's foresight in creating those separate accounts had given me the resources to stand my ground. Now I was ensuring that all our legal affairs were in impeccable order, with regular reviews and updates to reflect changing circumstances. But beyond the legal protections, I had learned that self-worth cannot be delegated or diminished by others' actions, not even family. The quiet dignity I had maintained throughout the conflict had ultimately earned more respect than any inheritance could have purchased. As the sun began to set over the cemetery, I placed a single white rose on Richard's headstone. "Until next time, my love," I whispered before turning toward home, my home, filled with memories of our past and possibilities for my future. If my story has touched you in some way, please share your thoughts in the comments. Have you experienced family conflicts over inheritance or had to stand up for yourself when it would have been easier to give in? Your stories and support mean so much to this community we're building together. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button if you found value in today's story. Remember, preparing for the unexpected isn't pessimistic. It's one of the most important acts of love we can offer those we care about. Thank you for listening, and I'll be back next week with another story from my heart to yours.